Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the podcast where we take a look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our general joy of being alive. And of course, we have to talk about sustainable design and beauty and all those other things as well. And today, I want to introduce you to Alexander Josephson from Partisans in Toronto. Alexander, welcome to the show. It is an honor to meet you.
Joe, thanks for inviting me. I'm happy we could make it happen. And from great Toronto to Cape Breton, I say hello. And to your audience, thanks for listening, and really looking forward to the conversation about how we make the world a better place. It's near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, me too. This is going to be a fun one. Let's start with sort of one of my favorite questions for architects. Tell me why you chose architecture as a career, and then tell us about the pathway that you followed that ultimately led to the founding of Partisans, and then tell us a little bit about how Partisans has evolved and how your role has changed with it.
Yeah, so I fell into architecture because, like you do everything in life, for love. I think my first crush, I drew this young lady, I think I was 8 years old, a castle. And I was a very tactile, visual person. I had real trouble with language as a child and didn't really come into my own academically until grade 10 or 11, and kind of a hockey stick from there academically. But I had the gift of the hand. And so I drew her a castle, and I heard that from my parents, that's who architects draw castles. And that was interesting. And I ended up getting a date playing snakes and ladders from drawing her a castle. And I was like, oh, this is fun. So it was all about girls.
Well, fair enough.
But honestly, what happened was I learned that architects are the people who draw buildings. And at the time in the 80s, it was kind of an interesting period for architecture. Frank Gehry, Rem Koolhaas, SMLXL was sort of in the works in the early 90s. And you had the beginnings of parametric design. And it was an interesting moment as a kid to be interested in architecture. But what was more interesting is in Canada, obviously, architects don't command a ton of respect. We're kind of treated like artists or something like this. And so it was very rebellious to say you wanted to be an architect. No one wanted to be an architect in my circles. Didn't know anybody in high school that wanted to be an architect. Didn't know anybody in my family's circle of friends that was an architect. And they were very accomplished people, was pretty fortunate upbringing. And what I realized, it was saying you wanted to be an architect was like telling my parents I wanted to be an actor. It was rebellious. And so on the one hand, it was like, oh, I draw the crush a castle. On the other hand, this was pissing my parents off. It was rebellious. So it was architecture instead of drugs and alcohol or gothic clothing and piercings. And, that's the story. It had nothing to do with physics or math or drawing. It was all about rebelling in a way. And then that obviously perfectly leads into Partisans, because Partisans is about a counter argument to how we should be thinking and speaking about architecture and speaking truth to power when it comes to the relationship between architects and architectural design and power centers and policies in government, as well as pushing clients to do better work and being able to say no versus yes all the time. And, architects, in my opinion, have an incredible opportunity to shape the world, and our ideas and education are valuable. And so calling ourselves Partisans was also about representing a cause, fighting for a cause, which is freedom in design, being able to do what we really feel is right, and being able to say that to our clients and feel confident in our expertise, but also our vision. And architecture is about making the world a better place. The citizens of Athens had to take an oath to leave the city a better place after they left it from when they inherited it. And I still believe in that today.
That's a beautiful thing. And look, you can't move things forward if you're solidly entrenched in the mainstream. You have to be a little bit of a rebel. Otherwise, you can't step out and look at where the holes are and where the opportunities are. So I love the rebels. Let's dig a little deeper on that. On your website, it talks about, Partisans essentially positions architecture, bigger than that. It positions architecture as something political and cultural and not just functional. So what responsibility do architects have today to move things
I mean,
forward?
we all know that
Place?
the big issue is most buildings fail in their functional raison d'etre. I mean, we always hear about these ugly, leaky, cold, drab, awful buildings that people live in, or these follies that have leaky roofs. Like I find it so funny sometimes that, this idea that architecture is so driven by function. Architecture is driven by force. Form follows force. The people who are commissioning a project, along with those who design it and deliver it, it takes a village. If you're going to try and do something that is at all ambitious or innovative, you need a group of people fighting for that cause, because everything, especially in the Canadian context, is set up to fight innovation or fight difference or prevent anything unfamiliar from happening. And so we get these sort of drab, quote unquote, pragmatic functional outcomes, which, I'm sorry, but beauty, aesthetics, the psychological impact of architecture is all these things are a manifestation of your values as a culture. And if your values are just about managing risk and not establishing a voice as a culture, then of course our cities will end up looking and feeling drab and not performing at the level they need to compete globally. Because in the end, our cities are competing economically through the urban form. You can have the best food, you can have the best diversity, but if you don't have an enjoyable city fabric and a beautiful city fabric, it really does a disservice to those incredible virtues. And so that's why architecture is political. It's a manifestation of our values. And I think Canada in particular has a moment right now where the world is listening to our values. Post Davos, we're saying Canada, this is when we should start investing in ourselves. I was at the Reference Library in Toronto last night speaking to this, just like you said the word joy. We need to wrap ourselves in the Canadian flag and feel the joy of being Canadian and invest in ourselves, invest in our architects, invest in our visionaries, and really point towards establishing our voice and rejecting this idea that we should outsource the solutions to global, quote unquote, superstars and experts. Because this is essentially what Canada has done. And it's done a disservice to, I think, the well-being of builders, architects, and engineers in Canada.
I agree. Oh, look, let's dive a little bit on that. Let's talk about Toronto. Toronto is growing madly, like the rate at which
It was.
Sorry, yeah, but it's seen this extraordinary growth. I mean, you just drive along Lakeshore for, or the Gardner
It's completely
West.
stalled. There's nothing happening.
It's all slowed down now, has it?
Slowed down. Well, this is the propaganda, right? No one's telling the truth. The truth is it's stopped. The music stopped. And the music stopped not because of some underlying con. The music stopped because of policies and government regulation, along with just some realities of a lack of growth in this country. And hopefully Mr. Carney changes the way this country operates, but there is a massive gulf developing in the housing industry and building and construction industry in Canada right now across the board. There's a few pockets of places where there's still development happening institutionally and residentially in the country, but the big markets, Toronto and Vancouver, you can hear a pin drop. And that's because of a combination of incredibly long IRR. Municipal governments and institutions in Canada refuse to accept the fact that they're part of a capitalist infrastructure. We're not a socialist country. You're part of a free capital market society. And for that to work properly, you can't have 10-year IRRs on 6-story residential houses, developments, or towers at all. You have to do things faster, more efficiently. You can't have 32% development charges and be subsidizing infrastructure deficits that other sources of income should be paying for and GDP growth should be paying for by extracting it from housing, which is what occurred. Municipal and federal government was xenophobic. On the one hand, we're celebrating how multicultural and diverse we are, but we're preventing foreign investment in our real estate, which essentially took the bottom out under the financial apparatus that was part of, there's not one thing that drives a market. It's a lot of things that have to be humming. And when you take away 2, 3, 4 of it's like a 6-legged stool. You can take away a couple of the legs and it'll still be a stool. But if you take away 5 of them, there's no stool. It all comes crashing down. So I think we've got an own goal that happened here. And we really have to change the way we think in this country. And time matters, speed matters, because the sort of vacillating we do, and the kind of hand-wringing we do, self-doubt, the kind of colonial hangover, we got to get over it and start celebrating ourselves and take some risk and be confident in what we're going to do as a nation and be confident in our designers, engineers, and give them the mandates and the opportunities to do great things.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Boy, that was a lot and some really extraordinary things. When did the wall come up, Alexander? Was there a specific point in time where you could say, this is where, the last leg was removed?
The housing market is death by 1,000 slashes, really. Like, you basically had this situation where municipalities couldn't find the money to build infrastructure, parks, culture, and they can't increase their own tax base. The reality is that incomes in Canada haven't kept up. So GDP growth in Canada for the last 12 years has been terrible. And that's because we've put regulations in place across the board, not just in the building industry, but also every other industry. And so we have a lagging economy, we have lagging incomes. Everybody keeps on talking about affordability, like we're going to make buildings cheaper. That's a lie. Buildings are not cheaper right now. They're more expensive, actually, because inflation has occurred. There's tariffs. There's all sorts of other reasons. But you can't expect people to be able to afford something by making it 10% cheaper. You've got to double people's incomes in Canada. The reality is, and it's so sad, our politicians think so small. What Carney should come out and say is, in the next 10 years, we need to double incomes in Canada. To do that, we need massive growth. Massive growth. Like, people will be able to afford a home if we can double their incomes. And the GDP per capita in Canada is the same as Alabama in the United States. It's ridiculous. We're a much richer nation than Alabama, much more resource rich than Alabama. We're more resource rich than the United States. And the idea that we can't increase incomes by 50% over the next decade or double them in the next decade, we have to set ambitious goals and sort of recognize that our housing issues and our food affordability issues, there's something common to all these affordability issues: income. And no one's talking about this. All the architecture professions talking about making things cheaper, prefab, all this stuff. It's like, you're never going to make it cheap enough if people's incomes are stagnant in an inflationary environment. So I find it all kind of like a bunch of lies. And so this idea that architects are going to save the world by making things cheaper, I mean, come on, don't lie to me. Like, you'd have to make things 50% cheaper for people to afford them. 50%, not 10, not 15, not 20, 50. And, like, people who are not able to afford a mortgage right now on a $700,000 or $1 million property aren't going to be able to afford it $900,000. Or $850,000. They need to make double their income. Instead of making 75 grand, they need to make 150 grand or 140 grand. How do we get there? And instead of architects thinking that we're going to bottom of the barrel our buildings and we're going to start building buildings like Ford built cars, like, sure, okay, let's build that industrial apparatus. Like, we've had the biggest automotive apparatus in the world outside of the United States and Japan and Korea, right? We have this incredible, none of that infrastructure is used to build much architectural components. We don't make glass in Canada. We hardly build facades. I mean, we make some. A lot of curtain walls come from Europe and Asia. Electrical equipment, HVAC equipment, some of it comes from here. Like, we haven't built out an industrial complex for architecture in a meaningful way in Canada. And so we pay for that. We pay a premium to import everything. And so, like, this idea that architects are suddenly going to bottom of the barrel, we're going to make things cheaper and they're going to be more beautiful and they're going to be better. It's sort of, I mean, that sounds like some Houdini stuff to me.
Healthier, more energy efficient, significantly cheaper, all going to happen simultaneously. Yeah, that is quite the tall order. And
but that's what we're saying to each other in our echo chamber in architecture. Right. That's what we're saying.
Imagine a building where natural light flows freely, solar heat gain is under control, and comfort is unmatched. With Solera translucent glazings, you can create spaces that work better, feel better, and deliver lasting value. Learn how at advancedglazings.com.
Right. Yeah. So can I take you back to Toronto for just a second? I'm curious
Yeah.
about the buildings that have gone up, like that good period where we had a lot of construction going on along the lake shore. I mean, it used to be, it kind of stopped at Liberty Village and now it's all the way almost to Oakville. It's incredible. What do you feel about those communities that are emerging down along?
Let's talk about it. I love numbers. So we built 325,000 odd condo units over the last 20 years. Let's say, okay? Let's say the top 2% of earners, people say architects, oh, we live in this ivory tower, we work for the 1%. Let's talk about the 1 or 2%. Let's say out of 325,000 units built, 2%, that's 7,000 units. Let's say the top 2% of earners who would have bought or invested in condos, let's talk about that. 7,000 units divided by, say, 300 units a building or 200 units a building. That should have gotten you 50 buildings or something, or 35 buildings, let's just say, that are extraordinary, or at least higher end, higher design, higher quality. Please tell me the 35 buildings between Toronto and Hamilton that are world-class architectures. I can think of 5 or 6, maybe 7, 5 or 6. So I can think of, from a residential construction perspective, I can think of the 2 Norman Foster projects. I can think of the big Bjark Ingels project that's going up. I can think of a couple of the early Architects Alliance buildings that were more ambitious before they had to start basically catering to very commodified developer needs. There's a couple of small Hurrier Pontorini projects that were good, again, before they became a machine. So I can think of, Jeannie Gang's project that's going up. So 6 buildings, 7, maybe 8. When it comes to really good. Whereas you go to cities like London, you go to cities like Singapore, these are different places. The responsibility the cities put on architects and developers, particularly in those contexts, is much higher from a design perspective. It's not a technical bar that they have to primarily leap above. It's a design bar. And that's just simply not what's happening in Toronto and Hamilton. And I think that we've gotten 325,000 units out of it, but have we gotten the grandeur of a world-class city out of it? I mean, Anthony Bourdain, when he flew into Toronto, was like, gosh, what did they do to themselves here? He was driving in on the Gardiner and he was like, this was such an opportunity. What did they do? And it was because people were, frankly, on all sides. You had the municipalities extracting value and design for paying for things that they shouldn't have with buildings for people. You had customers who were not super sophisticated buying things that they knew very little about. They knew more about the car they were buying for $50,000, $60,000, $100,000 versus the $1 million or $500,000 condos they were buying in terms of their operation and qualities, performance, architecture, beauty. And then you have developers who, realized that it didn't pay to think. It didn't pay to offer something better because the city didn't reward them and the market wasn't going to reward them. And so they didn't. And so I think that, we've had the opportunity, of course, at Partisans and a few other firms have had the opportunity to design some interesting forward-thinking projects. But the number of them that got actually built, it's 5 or it's 6, 7.
So what does London do differently? What does Singapore do differently? How do they instruct? What controls do they put in place, or what absence of controls are in place to ensure that?
I think it comes back to our original discussion. We have to start celebrating ourselves. We have to be patriotic. We have to embrace the joy of being Canadian, invest in ourselves, invest in design, invest in architects, do a design competition for the Prime Minister's residence, do a design competition for the Leader of the Opposition's residence. We have to look at those municipalities like Singapore, incredible. When you want to build a building in Singapore proper, the Singapore Municipal Planning Office has, I would say, a tennis court size room with a 1 to 100 model of their city. Okay. And in the municipal planning office, that model sits. Buildings are, a meter, 4 feet tall. It's enormous. Okay. Highly detailed. And there is a model building office. And if you want to build a building in a prominent place in Singapore, you have to prove to them and to an international panel of architects that your building speaks to a critical zeitgeist of innovation in architecture objectively. And then you have to put your model in, which you pay for, into the city model. And if it's approved, you become part of the legacy of that city. That is a completely different way of thinking about how you design a city and how the municipality and private interests interact, whether it's a bank or a residential real estate developer or a hotel. You have to prove that what you're doing is relevant and genuinely innovative. It's not a sleight of hand. There's no Houdini. It's very objective. And London does the same thing. You can't build in London very easily if you're not being ambitious. That is a very sophisticated place. There's other examples of that. I think that obviously I'm being, a bit pedantic about it. There's junk that passes through in every city, right? For various reasons, right? You can't catch everything. But, the model of the city of Toronto down at City Hall is 1 to 1,000. There's no resolution to that model. There's no human scaled qualities to the experience of that depiction of our city. And those subtle things about scale and representing things and drawing the experience from a human being's perspective, that changes the way you think about things. And that's why I say architecture is political, because it's a manifestation of how you see your society and how you see your civilization. So, yeah, I think those cities see it very differently than we do.
Let me ask you kind of a strange question. I was just in Montreal last week, and I always feel comfortable walking around Montreal. Now, I love Toronto, too. There's many things I love about, the downtown area in Toronto and just the city.
Yep.
But when I'm in Toronto, I always feel overwhelmed. I always feel overwhelmed. And it's not just because population. I've been to major cities all over the world. But Toronto just has this feeling of speed, rush. Yep. Montreal, there's plenty of cars, there's plenty of traffic moving around, as you know. There's plenty of people moving around. But I still feel just a lot more engaged and part of the city. Can you help me explain why I have those two different emotional reactions to these two Canadian cities?
I would have to get in your head.
Well, let's give her a go.
It's an inspired question. So let's think about that.
It feels intense in Toronto.
So I have a theory about it. But listen, I think you're exaggerating the comfortability of walking around Montreal. I was just there. And it's in relationship to its local microclimate. I don't think they've developed an architecture that really grapples with the reality of wind and cold for 8 months of the year there. I think that the only part of the city that does that properly is, of course, the old city, which is at a much denser scale, right? You're talking about 5, 6-story buildings, 4-story buildings with, streets that are 20 feet wide, 30 feet between windows. And that's lovely because you open your window and if you can see someone's pupils 20 feet away, you can't see them from 80 feet away. And this idea of being able to see your neighbor, this is what defines London. Right. This is what defines Paris. It's what defines Rome. And what we've done is essentially like a middle ground that mediates the tower in the park issue of like high modernism and Le Corbusier with a sort of like monotonous podium language, right? And so why do you feel overwhelmed by Toronto? Maybe it's because you don't have landmarks to orient yourself and work towards when you're walking. It's a monotonous experience in a way. And Toronto is a much bigger city than Montreal.
Yes.
It's really a big city. Toronto is a very spread out place. I walk it much more than I used to now. But if you find a neighborhood that you love, it's one of the most walkable places in the world. It really is lovely to walk in Toronto. But the issue is, unless you know it really well and can kind of think of the landmarks that are sort of there, we haven't built enough of these follies, these landmarks that define nodes. Like there's no building at Yonge and Eglinton of any architectural repute in Toronto.
Right.
And yet it's one of the most important intersections in the city. And it's bereft of any cultural qualities of architecture. So to get there, you're like, well, how do I get there? What's my experience of getting there? And it's basically like you're trudging up a bunch of monotonous podium tower experience. It's sort of like 6th Avenue in New York. It's not a great experience. And the rest of New York, in fact, has got all sorts of amazing experiences. But 6th Avenue, that 30-block stretch tends to be a trudge. And I think New York also learned a lot from that because it was developed in the early aughts and it wasn't successful. And so then they went on to really applying much more ambitious ideas along the High Line and other neighborhoods in New York. But I think that your experience of Toronto is related to just feeling like you're in an overwhelming fabric that's quite repetitive in a certain sense. And getting from neighborhood to neighborhood is like, what are you walking past to get from one to the other? And it's sort of a soup.
Yeah, you're right. The monotony is really a very strong component in it. Yeah.
And that goes back to the tall building guidelines that all of these podium towers had to abide by, that have zero scalar or cultural sensitivity to retail experiences and how diverse they need to be. Podiums, what Toronto should have done 30 years ago is say, hey, here are 10 standard tower languages, but the podium has to be special. They have to be an architectural folly up to 10 floors. And you pick from these tower languages. We're fine with them being repetitive because we can get you economies of scale because we're repeating these 10 languages over and over, and we can build a local vernacular to build those very high quality because we're using so much of it. We never did that. And what in fact happened was like this monotonous glass curtain wall at grade that doesn't identify the qualities of a family-run business. It destroys them because it creates a volume that's expensive to furnish and fit out and heat and cool. And then you have a signage issue. You can't do heirloom signage because they have these monotonous signage guidelines. It takes all the joy and the difference out of what you see in a retail environment in other cities that defines the streetscape from the city. And this stuff really wasn't understood until the last 5 years. A lot of people started pushing back, architectural critics in the city. But in a way, it's like, is it too late? No, like there's still room to do smaller, very ambitious projects. But the problem is the city doesn't want the smaller sites developed. And so you have this fight where it's like they can't get their heads around how these smaller sites should also be 30 or 40 story or 20 story buildings. And they want to apply the logic of what a 60 or 50 story building should be to a 20 story building. And that makes it financially impossible to achieve. You can't have garbage trucks pulling in without being able to reverse out of a 10,000 square foot site or an 8,000 square foot site. There's not enough room for a garbage truck to turn around inside of a footprint like that. But we've essentially made the garbage truck the arbiter of our streetscapes. Garbage trucks and fire trucks.
Right.
That's what's defining the urban planning and design of the first 2 floors of our podiums across the cities. And so there's been some recognition that these policies have been a sort of albatross. But, like the building boom's over. We got to do a new wave now. And the architecture can't be subject to the same just unambitious thinking. And frankly, tail wagging the dog policies around urban planning.
Is there anything we can do to break the monotony and the dullness of what we've created already?
Yes, force it. You've got to have a willpower. You got to say, we can do better. There's architecture firms and developers. Studio Varo and Aptis Foundation just published a book about courtyard buildings and 6-story, 0 setback, single stair buildings. We wrote Rise and Sprawl, which critiques the tall building guidelines as well as design languages of podiums. We suggested that podiums should be follies. They really should. The first 10 floors of the city is what people experience. Make those architecturally significant. But instead, everything is being washed out, right? And so, there are people who are fighting, and they have incredible willpower because it's an environment in which change is so slow, and there's great minds. There are, in fact, a handful of developers that truly want to do great work, and they know they can still make a lot of money. I don't believe it's necessarily just about radically expensive facades like Forma by Frank Gehry. There's other ways you can make extraordinary architecture. We certainly have proven it in some of the stuff that we've done. But it's also about proportion. It's about materiality. And I want to talk about sustainability because the big thing right now is like, we're going to build everything out of wood. We are importing mass timber products from Europe. We still can't figure out how to make them cheaply here. It's ridiculous. Like what we're being sold is a lie. We're subsidizing a series of buildings in Canada right now that are expensive to build because A, we don't have the IP. It's European owned IP and it's European wood coming into Canada. And also we're being lied about the fact that Quebec and Ontario have 2 of the most green power grids in the world. So things that are made here have lower embodied carbon. the sustainability approach in Ontario, Quebec should be different than the sustainability approach in Alberta. They're fundamentally different energy grids. They're fundamentally different building trades that exist and local industries. So this idea that sustainability is treated the same way in every jurisdiction globally is the biggest lie, right? And it's mostly been lobbyists and companies and institutions that have a financial interest in selling a particular product that have driven this approach. So I think you have to be way more subtle about how Quebec and Ontario measures sustainability, because we have the greenest power grids for producing architectural and infrastructural products, yet we're not making them, right? So I think that we have to really think hard about what we're saying and how we're saying it.
Manage the connection between building occupants and the outside world using Solera translucent glass. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
Let's dive into that issue of the differences in terms of the way we manage sustainability, say, between Southern Ontario and Calgary or Edmonton. Can you actually spell out how that manifests itself in terms of, actual...
Yeah. So, for example, the power grid in Alberta, unfortunately, it's fossil fuel driven. Well, that's because the fossil fuels are there. Ontario is building out the largest nuclear infrastructure in the world. Quebec has the largest hydroelectric power infrastructure outside of China, right? So you're talking about two jurisdictions that if aluminum is made in Quebec or concrete is made in Quebec or concrete is made in Toronto, it's drawing from a power grid that's either nuclear or hydro. And so, people like to say aluminum is a terrible material. And it's like, well, where is it made? How is it made? Is the bauxite right next to the mine, right next to the factory that's next to the hydro plant? Yes. And so this idea that we have to pivot our country from an energy perspective so that we say, well, our products are the lowest embodied CO2 in the world. Why? Because this is our power grid. This is how we generate that power. Okay. And then, by the way, it's also the most ethical source of these products in the world because we're Canada. And we're not doing that enough. Instead, we're sort of saying, well, you can't build in concrete and be sustainable anywhere. And it's like, well, that's not true. It's true that's very unsustainable in a place like Alberta, but that's not the same calculus in Quebec or Ontario. And especially in Ontario, where you have huge gravel pits. Like the proximity of the raw materials to the plants is zero. You don't have to import. So I think we have to be more honest about the realities of our infrastructure and also be careful about this idea that the government's going to subsidize with incredibly high tax rates we have in Canada an entire building industry. It's like, how is that sustainable? How is some of the highest taxes in the world sustainable? Sustainable doesn't just mean environmentally sustainable. Are our processes something that we can actually maintain? Are our policies something we can actually maintain? Is it sustainable? And I think what's happened is that we've come to a head in this moment right now in Canada where people are suffering. And it's because of the unsustainability of our practices. It's not just about embodied carbon. We build slow, that's not sustainable. You have to build fast. If you can't give ways for people to build fast, you're going to make it less sustainable. And we don't want to talk about this stuff. We don't want to talk about it. It's too complicated or something.
Yeah, well, let's hope those conversations start because you're right. I mean, we had our lost decade there where our GDP per capita just lagged everybody. It lagged every sort of developed nation for a long time.
Let's hope it doesn't become a lost 2 decades.
Yeah.
Because a few big projects doesn't an economy make. You know what I mean? Like, we need small businesses and manufacturers and guys who are carving stone, like masons. We need people to make things here.
Yeah, we need to move down the value chain so that we have higher margins. And
absolutely.
That's where you get the income from.
Yeah, you have to add value. You have to add IP. And if you're just selling piles of rock, well, I mean, unfortunately, you're not going to get a premium for it.
We sell lots of piles of rocks, that's for sure. But let me see if there's a tie-in here. I saw a terminology or a term on your website, post-physical architecture. What does that mean? Is there any sort of crossover here? But regardless, even if there's not, I want to know how you define post-physical architecture.
Well, first of all, like architecture is a human experience, a spatial experience that fulfills a functional need for a spatial requirement, right? And there was this huge interview, very famous, Richard Serra on Charlie Rose, where he's talking about his friend Frank Gehry and how Charlie Rose says that Frank Gehry is the most incredible artist. And Richard Serra says that's absolute BS. He's not an artist, he's an architect, and there's zero overlap. Art is the vacuum, the void, the almost insurmountable mountain of the imbued lack of functionality that defines the basis of how art is brought into the world. It is inutility that really makes, according to Richard Serra, the art so important. Okay, whereas architecture has utility and it has compromise and it has clients. Artists are a very different thing. And I think that the attempt to mediate and bring aesthetics into architecture is extraordinarily important because, as Richard Serra says, architecture is useful, it's functional, and compromised by groups of people who have opinions along the way in how it's crafted. So we thoroughly believe that you have to have a village of people who want to create something different that not only functions but performs aesthetically, formally, so that the outcome is extraordinary, so that the improbable is inevitable. But you have to have this incredible willpower. And the question is, in a world that's becoming more and more digital, what is the role of the architect? And a few years ago, my father asked me to design his memorial. He was being treated for cancer. And, he was like, listen, I may not make it, but I'd like you to design our family monument in case I don't make it, right? I was like, whoa, that's a heavy responsibility. And then a developer said, hey, what are you doing in terms of digital, Alex? The real estate developer, a friend of mine, was like, I've made more money in digital investments than I have in real estate development. I was shocked. He was like, what are you doing as an architect to manage or mitigate or think about bits instead of bricks? And I was like, whoa, that's fascinating. It like hit me like a ton of bricks and bytes. And I was designing this memorial, and then it became clear to me that our lives are so trapped on our phones and in our computers. And in fact, the beauty of architectural design now is trapped in the iterative qualities are all trapped in digital experiences now and digital files. And so I realized that our lives are photos, videos, notes, website articles, all these things trapped in our devices. And that my family's memorial should be a digital immersive space. And I said, well, okay. Started designing that. And I thought of it like being inside the Minority Report of your mind, this spatial immersion into your information, the most important things that were for my family. And my wife challenged me because she's in venture. She was like, why don't you build a presentation, a deck for a totally virtual architecture of memorialization for me? And we'll go find investors. And post-physical architecture means finding solutions that are immersive and spatial that employ architectural thinking in a purely physical context. So in the past, that was designing sets for movies, for instance, but I invented a digital memorialization space, which is really a digital cemetery. And I raised venture capital, and I called the business Cumulus, like cloud. And we're launching across 300 cemeteries and funeral homes in the United States right now. And I think the point about post-physical architecture is that architects need to also think about the business and entrepreneurship opportunities that are offered from 10 years of education and thought and testing that we go through. You don't have to just build houses or schools. There's applications for immersive experiences that are completely digital and need architectural thinking.
Tell me a little bit more about Cumulus. Like, what is the actual experience for the families, who use it? What do they actually interact with when they choose to work with Cumulus?
Well, have you taken a look at it?
No. Well, very
Okay,
briefly. Very briefly.
I don't know if this is your style of interview, but I'm happy to share it with you right now. Better to show, not tell.
Sure.
It's so funny with architecture and design podcasts. Design is so visual, and yet podcasts are oral. And it's like, how do you describe these things? How do I describe the facade of the Rolex building on Bloor Street in Toronto that we did in words? Like how do you describe the impact that made on that high street for Toronto, and architecture inspired by the Cyclops magnifying lens on a Rolex watch and the Jubilee bracelet? Like, how do you describe that? And how do you describe the collaboration with Arturo Tedeschi on some of the pattern language we used to imbue the CNC milling process into the stone? And it's like, this is the conundrum of architectural podcasts, right? Like, how do you describe these things and do them justice without showing them? So I'll just show you Cumulus.
Sure. Let's do it.
Guys.
Is there a way to share that screen there? Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I'm going to share it right here. So cumulus.world, and it loads a new way to remember. And what it loads you into is this is really a snapshot of the central visualization experience of your memories. So when I said the minority report of your memories, digital cemetery, this is the immersive experience that we've created and been able to generate using parametric and computational design algorithms that are then offered through a visualization platform that is native to the backbone of the internet and the browser. So it's a next generation platform for age-old rituals, coming together with people we love to share memories, grieved loved ones, and celebrate life. So this was inspired by my father and uncle who wanted me to create an archive. And so once you log in, and I tell you, building software is not like building buildings. Holy cow, it's never over.
No.
It's like a never-ending journey. I had to relearn everything in a way. But I'll show you my family cloud, but I'll also show you a cloud that has 86 participants building it. So this is my family cloud. I've built this time capsule setting. I'm building that for my daughters. They'll get it when they're 20. It has all sorts of notes from me. So these are my ancestors. So this is my mother's mother. And you can load these images and you can comment and like them. This is me with David Mirvish and Frank Gehry at the Pritzker Prize ceremonies. This is my wife and child, Allegra, my first daughter, and my wife who inspired me really to bring this technology to the world and take the leap. My grandmother, who was an entrepreneur, who also put together a family album when she was a successful businesswoman in the 80s, and that I've preserved and digitized and brought into this platform. This is my mother going through that album that my grandmother put together in our house, and it's falling apart. And I realized the fragility of these things, and I wanted to do my ancestors justice by preserving and being able to pass that on generationally. And there's music here, there's websites here. My father survived chemo and COVID, intubation in the hospital. He also inspired me to keep on going while he was sick that year in 2022. And my brother, my father's interview after he survived, and the day I got engaged, everything is here. Our books are here, video, still images, everything's here. And I can put this on autoplay if we have a family reunion or if there, God forbid, is a funeral. We don't have to make much of a leap. We can listen to music on it. These things I know will live on, and you can design the space yourself. You can define how the cloud looks and whether you're in the cloud or on the ground. And also what's really important is I've located all the graves in Toronto of my ancestors. And, you know, cemeteries are notoriously hard places to locate people, but I've been able to do that for my relatives. And my great-great-grandparents are buried here in that point right there. And I can pass that on generationally, and I can select whether this is public or private. I can add people up in the upper right-hand corner here. There's all sorts of toggles. I can add collaborators, contributors, and admins. It's not a free-for-all like Instagram where people can say terrible things. It's about preserving your legacy. You can save and drop files very easily. You can connect to your arrangement partners or your trust partners if you have insurance. And it's just a way to ensure that in a digital world that our lives lived aren't left to dissolve into the meaninglessness of the cloud, because no Google Drive cares about your future, you know? So I really felt like it was incumbent on me to create something that was poetic, useful, but also imbued with architectural thinking and easy to use, and a positive space in which we can collaborate on our legacy as a family. And I'm looking forward to growing it and changing it over time. But that's call that my second hat. I do that for a lot of time during the week. I'm running a technology company as well as a 25-person architecture firm doing everything from the RBC stage replacement to the Budweiser and Molson Amphitheater on Ontario Place to the Hearn to a couple of residential projects, our first international projects in Europe and Puerto Rico. Like, it's been a crazy ride.
Ambition is a beautiful thing. And for the people who are listening on audio only, what we just looked at was an immersive environment on the computer with images displayed essentially floating in the cloud before you, and you can adjust which ones are more immediate and more prevalent. But it's a collection of memories and images and sound as well that is, meant to connect you back to the people that you love and loved. So it is really interesting, and it's Cumulus, CUMULUS.world for those listening. We're getting close to the end, Alexander. I want to have you back. I'm going to talk you into offline. I'm going to talk you into coming back.
The opposite of our last experience.
We're going to go deeper on, I'm going to get myself a little bit more educated, and I might even do something more like a summit where we go on a little bit of a deeper dive on what, city planning can do to help create communities that give us a sense of awe and a sense of belonging and a sense of, life worth living.
Cities just need to reward difference. They need to reward the people who care enough to invest and dream and think and want to tell a different story. Like, our architecture in Canada should be as diverse as our faces. We talk about this diversity and this food and this culture, and yet our cities, so it's like, it should be that diverse. It should be that delicious. It should be a feast of the eyes. It shouldn't make your eyes bleed. And you should be able to be proud of these things. And I think you've got a great platform, a great audience, and I'd be happy to come back and talk about more.
Yeah, let's do it. Before you go, I have to ask you my $1 million question. There's a question I ask every single episode, and I'm not letting you get away with it.
I thought I got away with it.
No, not a chance. Answer it from whatever perspective you'd like, Alex. What makes a great building?
Oh, a great building elicits an extreme emotional reaction, either hatred or love.
Hatred?
Yeah.
Okay. Where's the greatness that arises from hatred?
Because in the end, it moved your neurons. If a building, listen, everybody wants to tear down all these brutalist buildings. They're stunning buildings. People hate them. I love them. I think that brutalist buildings are just the teenagers of architecture. They're just a little too young to be appreciated for what they are. And we need to make sure we don't knock them all down, because they are imbued with incredible will, incredible force, not just energy. I mean, all that concrete, but these buildings elicit extreme hatred in a lot of people. And that's a good thing. It means they're reacting. They recognize it's a familiar artifact in the cityscape. It stands out. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. It helps define a diversity, and it helps actually define a time, your place in time. Architecture is a clock. It tells the spirit of a time, and those buildings tell the story of a time and an era. And if we erase them, we erase that era, and we can't learn from it ever again. And I think that's a tragedy. Whereas a building like OCAD in Toronto, or other buildings that are more contemporary that stand out, yes, they elicit also strong reactions, but mostly that building, for me, elicits love and joy. Frank Gehry's building, mostly joy, less controversial. But I think that successful buildings not only are able to be reused for something else in 100 years, as Aldo Rossi said, but they elicit an emotional response, and not a minor one.
I love it. All right. Alex, thank you so much. That was an absolutely extraordinary conversation, and one that I want to have a follow-up on for sure. Thank you for your time. I hugely appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, and thanks for having me.
You take care.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.